Everyone, good afternoon. My name is Nate McGaha. I am the Executive Director of Arts North Carolina. And I want to thank you all for joining us for this afternoon's webinar, Arts Advocacy at Every Level During the COVID-19 Pandemic. We're actually going to be doing this in two parts. We're going to have part one, which is going to be primarily about the pandemic, what you should be doing right now, our advocacy efforts, our data collection, and just kind of a sense of everything that we've got going on with the COVID-19 pandemic. We will have questions at the end of that section, at which point we will move into part two. Part two is going to be more of an advocacy training session, talking about Arts North Carolina, who we are and what we do, as well as a conversation about how to have conversations with elected officials, and maybe a little bit of touching on things like advocacy campaigns, as well as election engagement and other things. So a few housekeeping notes before we, before we get going. If everyone can please keep their mics muted during the presentation. We want to make sure that that everybody can hear and we don't get any background noise. I know a lot of us are at home now. So if you do have questions as we're going, you can type those into the chat space. Christine Olson, our facilitator, or our administrator, is going to be facilitating that, and then she'll read aloud any questions that get typed in. If for whatever reason you are on the phone, you're unable to type the questions in, you can unmute at the questions portion and ask your questions then, but we would like to keep most of the questions through the chat box. Also, please keep your video off, just so that we can try and save bandwidth. We've got a lot of people, and we know that the internet is being used a lot more in the past week or so than it has been typically. So a little note about the slides. There's going to be a lot of information crammed onto some of the slides. That is on purpose. These slides are already available at the the Arts North Carolina COVID-19 Action and Resource Center. And then the links on those slides can be available. And we're going to go through some of those as we do move through the presentation today. So these are going to be a resource for you moving forward, probably for the next few weeks as we work through this situation. So obviously, I don't have to tell anybody on this webinar, this coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic is a massive global public health menace. Hundreds of thousands sick, tens of thousands dead. And it is obviously tragic what is going on. I'm not going to focus a lot on that issue. There's lots of news outlets to cover that, but we're talking more about the economic issue. And I know that certainly in the arts community, the nonprofit arts community, we are very concerned about what is happening and what is about to happen with the economy. So they are talking about the fact that this is going to be the biggest problem that we face in a generation. It's being compared to going into the Great Depression or World War II. So this is something that we're going to be working on for a while. We're going to walk through some steps of what you should be doing now, what you probably already are doing now, what Arts North Carolina is doing now. But first, a thought. Government is not going to solve this for us. Government is only going to be able to solve this with us. And that's really important to remember. They're only going to get us so far. We can't work together unless we communicate. It's going to be crucial to everything that we do moving forward. That communication is called advocacy. And that's what Arts North Carolina is going to be facilitating, has been facilitating, and will be working on throughout the duration of the pandemic. So talking a little bit about what your response should be, certainly we recommend that everybody follow all guidelines and recommendations from health officials. Don't go into work. We should be working from home, only going out for essentials. I don't need to tell you that.
Playing with my sound
definitely assess your situation. Have you made cancellations? How many things have been canceled? How many people were impacted? What was the expected attendance? Start figuring out what the financial impact is that going to be, both personally and certainly for your organization. Calculate the losses, but also any anticipated expenses that you're going to be looking at. And we're going to get more into how to use that later. Start making plans. I know everybody is already starting to figure out this issue. It's very difficult because last week's worst case scenario is this week's best case scenario. So start coming up with possible scenarios and contingencies. Plan for 30 days, 60 days. We don't know exactly how long the situation is going to last. But knowing, coming up with plans, working with your board, and knowing what's going to trigger when you're taking what actions is important. Collect the information to make the case. And this is going to be really important because we're going to be talking to government. We're going to be talking to government at all levels. So we need to start gathering all that information about the finances, but also the stories of what's going on and what you're doing and what your people are doing to work through this crisis. All of that's going to come into play. This part I can't stress enough. Find your allies and find your partners, and most importantly, find your tribe. You know, we're all going to be moving through this together. This is affecting everybody. So making sure that you're connecting and communicating with people who have similar goals and similar needs is going to be crucial. If you haven't already set up a weekly connection with people in your community that you know are going through the same thing, I encourage you to do that now. You just reach out on social media. Somebody's doing that because you're going to need a group in order to work through this situation. And we are really ready to start having this conversation across all levels of government. But for now, we got to address each level of government a little differently. Certainly at the federal level, we are already talking. You've seen several calls to action probably come out from me and Americans for the Arts to start making that case to Congress about why the arts are important and what our needs are. We're all about to have a catastrophic hit. So we're already asking the federal government for help. I had a conversation with somebody last week that said their board member was worried about whether or not it was appropriate for the arts to be having a conversation about money at this point. I can promise you that the airline industry did not wait until the pandemic was over to start talking to Congress about their needs. So this is really important that we have the conversation, but how we have that conversation is also very important. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Also at the state level, we have already sent out a call to action on that as well to contact the state representatives. Again, we are not pushing, we're just talking generally, making sure that they are there. This is a conversation that's going to be going on for a long time, but they're going to address those funding needs first at the federal level and then at the state level. So that's who we're asking for help. Now at the city and county level, I'm going to steal a little bit from a great orator and say, you know, we need to ask not what our county can do for us, but ask what we can do for our county and our school system and our city council. Go ahead and reach out and you know, let them know that you are there as an organization, as an individual. If you are comfortable, you can offer to help, to see if there's anything that you can do. But please, if you are going to offer to help your local government with anything and make yourself available, make sure that you are prepared to do so. If you want to offer help, that's a great way to start the conversation at this time. Certainly, we're going to be working with city and county government moving forward, as well as the school systems, as we all try and make sense of what this new reality. So that's what our response, or what everybody's response should be in general. Now, how Arts North Carolina specifically is tackling that. Obviously, we are following all of the guidelines by health officials. We are not holding any in-person meetings or events until it is allowed and recommended to do so. I am in my den right now, so we are all operating out of our homes, just like many people are across the country. You assess the situation, and this is really important. And we're going to show you some of the data that we've collected already. But if you have not yet done so, go take the Americans for the Arts COVID-19 Arts and Culture Sector Financial Impact Survey. It takes about 5 minutes. If you know your financial impact, it's good to have that information at the ready. And we're going to show you how important that information is. If you've already taken the survey, but you didn't have all of your information or all of your estimates at the time, it is important to retake that survey. You want to enter the cumulative impact each time. This data is going to be crucial as we move forward in the weeks and months to come in order to make our case. In terms of making plans, I do not know exactly what is happening with Arts Day. It is very possible that it is going to be postponed or go online. We are not sure yet. That is still 9 weeks away. It is not our priority. But I've got a meeting with Executive Committee and Arts Day Committee tomorrow. So if you're wondering about Arts Day, that's where that stands. We will let you know. We have also shifted the entire focus of Arts North Carolina to COVID-19. This is all we are dealing with. This is the only thing that we are dealing with. And it is the only thing that we plan to be dealing with, and the impact of addressing this for the foreseeable future. I know a lot of us are giving up plans. I know that we were working on a lot of things for the legislative session, but we really need to put all of our time and all of our effort specifically on this. Collect and prepare the stories of what is going on with your people and start getting the information together to make your case. I want to just click onto this real quick. This link right here will take you to a document, we'll hope. There we go. So that is the American for the Arts Action Fund produces these sheets. This is the one for North Carolina. Right now I'm putting this information out there because then that way we're working at the same thing at the state and federal level. I will be getting my own, our own action sheets together for North Carolina in the coming weeks as we start to build talking points and put that information together. So again, please use that link. Also, find your allies. Certainly the North Carolina Arts Council and I have been in constant communication over the last couple weeks. They are very busy working to make sure that all the grants are in process, both for fiscal year 20 and getting through the process for fiscal year 21, that those grants can go out and the state dollars that are already available can get to you with as little hangups as possible. So that is what they are focused very intently on right now, is making sure that whatever money they currently have available is moving through the system so that, and they're also listening to the field and kind of trying to triage what the effects of this is. Obviously, Americans for the Arts, our national arts advocacy partner, very important as a resource. A lot of our calls to action are going to go through them as well. So please make sure that you are connected to them and getting other people connected to them as well. Make sure your network is connected to our network. North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, I promise you, these guys are going to be absolutely essential in the weeks and months to come. They're kind of looking at broader nonprofit issues. I've been working with David Heinen for the last week and through the weekend trying to figure out unemployment issues and small business administration loans, things of that nature, which we are going to talk a little bit more about later. So stay tuned, but please make sure that you're checking out the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. SAN, which is the State Arts Action Network. That's what I'm talking about. This is my tribe. That's why you don't get a link to them. This is all of those leaders that are doing Nate's job, executive directors of the advocacy organization throughout the country. We have been in constant communication trying to sort through how all of this process is going to work, how we're going to react, and coordinating our efforts. So that's exactly why it's important to find that close-knit group of people that are going to be able to have these conversations with you, because we're going to be stronger if we can work together. Certainly, and I'm going to talk more about this later in the presentation, emergency funding and small business administration loans to nonprofit arts. That's going to be a huge focus of what we're doing, certainly in the short term and possibly in the long term. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Unemployment benefits. Unfortunately, the impact of this situation is going to put a lot of people in the arts industry onto unemployment insurance, collecting benefits for several weeks, at least until some of the bans on gatherings have been lifted and we can start to see normal operations coming back again. So we're going to cover that. I do want to just take a brief moment. We've got set up our resources at artsnc.org. Just running through quickly the Arts NC COVID-19 Action and Resource Center. Right at the top is going to click you over to the relief funds for artists and the arts. Right here is a listing of all of the funds that have been set up for COVID-19 response for individual artists or for arts organization or the arts in general. We're trying to make this a one-stop clearinghouse. There's some national ones on here as well. So please, grab this link and push that out to your networks so that we can have everybody finding these funds in one place and so that they can put their resources where they need to be. Also on the Action Center, right here is where the webinar is going to be posted. We will break this video down into part 1 and part 2 of the webinar, so you can focus just on the COVID-19 updates, or you can focus on the training. Obviously, right here is where we've got the links to the slides for the presentation that we're going through right now. Underneath that is going to be all of the COVID-19 arts updates. You can see we've got several calls to action that we put out already. If there's any further calls to action, news, updates, everything is going to show up right here in the Art States section. Also, I want to touch on, tell us how your legislator responded. This is specifically for the North Carolina General Assembly, but if you get a response via email or if you have a phone conversation, we encourage you to come back to this spot and enter that data, put your name, date of your visit. You can select the county that you're from. You can select the legislator that you're having that conversation. All 170 names are in there. Type of visit. And then if it's an email, just cut and paste in the comments section so that we do that. We monitor all of these as they get reported, and then they all go into a database so that myself and our lobbyist at Ken Melton and Associates can access this on our cell phones or our computers wherever we are. So, and sometimes, a lot of times we'll be looking and seeing of all those responses and who legislators have talked to before we go into meeting with them. So very important to stay on top of reporting those legislative visits. And then also this is, your standard resource link page. I know that you've seen a lot of these throughout, links to the CDC, North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, everybody's pandemic page, as well as resources for artists. So we encourage you to check that out. Let's see, I think I covered everything there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the COVID-19 arts financial impact specifically to our state. I want to stress, and I cannot stress this enough, that the numbers that we are looking at are not complete. Right now we're reporting, at least as of this morning, $2.25 million in financial impact. You can see over there on the right-hand side of the screen, that's $2 million in losses with $160,000 in expenses. We're going to talk a little bit more. I do want to point out that there have been 571 responses out of North Carolina. I want to say about 450 plus of those have been organizations, and then the remainder of that are individual artists. As I understand it, we are not collecting financial data on individual artist losses through this survey. If you are an individual artist, we do ask you to click the survey because there are some feedback that we get from you there. When it asks you what type of organization you are, you would click artist/creative workforce. Also, 91% of the organizations are reporting a canceled event of some type, and 91%. So we can start to see just how massive this process is. Oh, excuse me. Across so far, 150,000 people plus audience members that have been lost. That number is probably going up as we speak. So let's kind of look and see what the field is saying across the spectrum. How severe is this going to be? 66% of organizations expected the financial impact of this pandemic to be severe or extremely severe. I think that is very telling when we look at, this is what we're thinking, this is what we're seeing, and I think that we all know that this is where we at. Only 8% expected the financial impact to be somewhat severe or not severe at all. I don't know about you, but I would love to meet the 1% that thinks that this is not going to be severe. I'm kind of wondering who that is, but still, we're heading into something that's going to be very serious. when we're talking about the data that's been reported, only 21% out of all of those responses that we've gotten so far have reported the actual financial impact to their organization. That's only 1 in 5. Whereas if you look across the data here, a total of 55% either expected or definitely had losses, or was too soon to tell if they would have losses, but they didn't have the information when they filled out the survey. So that's over half the sector that still has to come back to this survey and fill in their information to tell us exactly what those financial losses are. So when you're starting to use this data to talk about the losses, make sure that you're explaining to legislators or whoever you're having this conversation with that this data is still incomplete, that we're only now starting to get the breadth and the scope of the financial impact that we're seeing. Certainly, expenses is going to be a big piece of this. We know that this is going to be costly as well as losing income. We're going to have expenses, but honestly, only 6% of the organizations that responded to the survey were able to report this, right? While 40% either had expected expenses or didn't have the information. So we want to make sure that we understand that those expenses as well as the losses are going to start adding up. And please encourage everybody that you're talking to fill out this survey, because it is really important that we have this data so that we can continue to make our case. Job losses, we know that they're coming. I guess the one silver lining in this part of the survey is that 1/3 of organizations said temporary permanent staff reductions were not likely at all. So that's really encouraging, that there was a good chunk of optimism out there, but over 1/3 of organizations said that they were expecting either temporary or permanent staff reductions to be either likely or extremely likely. So that's 1/3 of the organizations in the state that are reporting that they're probably going to have to make some kind of staff reductions, which is why, and we'll get into this in a little bit, talking about that unemployment is going to be so important, not only to the arts industry, but to every industry in the country and around the world. So how are we going to advocate this? How are we going to message for this? I think that it is important that we always keep in mind that this is a health crisis first, especially right now. People are dying, right? Yes, we are going to start having the conversation about the economic implications, and that is really important. And it is important to have that conversation. Those conversations are happening, but they have to always be secondary, always be polite, always acknowledge that this is a difficult time, that you're aware of the fact that whether or not it's in an email, whether or not it's in a phone call, make sure that you're kind of leading off with an acknowledgement that this is a very difficult time. Understand that this is a crisis that is happening across the entire population, not just of the United States, but of the planet. So your elected representatives are going to be just as overwhelmed as you are. So be respectful of that, right? You've got to always kind of put that out there. We can't come at people demanding that they do something. This is going to be a conversation. This is communication. Communication moves in both directions. Try and put yourself in the perspective of these elected representatives that are dealing with a lot right now. We are all going to be working with all levels of the government. We have to. If you are thinking right now that somebody else is going to be doing this work, please don't. Everybody has to take ownership and responsibility for having these conversations. Find your niche of where you're going to do. Maybe you want to focus on the federal, the state, or the local. You're going to focus on all three, but this is the time, because having these conversations is going to be crucial. Also crucial, making sure that you are patient, making sure that you are polite, and making sure that you are positive. Excuse me. We have to keep those 3 Ps in mind, because we don't want to hurt these relationships just as we're getting into this conversation. Also keep in mind that Arts North Carolina is working with our lobbyists as well as statewide and national partners, Americans for the Arts, North Carolina Arts Council, the State Arts Action Network. We're trying to figure out what the right message is and when the right time is to deliver it. So stay posted with us. We're trying to coordinate that message so that we can get that to you, so that you have the information and the resources that you need to have that conversation with your government officials at all levels. So right now, what are we talking about? please make sure that everybody is signed up for the Arts NC email list. Use the link right there, send it out to as many people as possible, because this is how we're going to be getting information out. This is how where the calls to action are going to be coming from. This is how we are going to coordinate that response. So we need to see a big spike in how many people are on the email list in the coming weeks, so that we can start communicating this to more and more people and encouraging more and more people to take action. Continue to keep updating that financial impact survey. Again, crucial that we're getting the most up-to-date cumulative data, so that we can, because the breadth and scope of our losses makes a real case for what this is doing to our sector economically. Responding to all those calls and actions, most of them are going to be emails. Many of them are going to be cut and paste, or fill in your information and hit send. It's going to be very quick. You can customize it as you need to. That always makes a real impact. But a lot of these initial things are going to be email communications, maybe a few phone calls. Usually you're going to be talking to voicemail. So those really quick calls to actions are good. Reporting those conversations, as I said, back to Arts North Carolina, we do look at that, and then start having these conversations at the federal, state, and local level. We're in the second half of the webinar. We're going to be talking a little bit about how to have those conversations and how to frame that conversation, and how to share your stories, and also educate before making an ask. And there's resources on our website as well that can help get you ready for that. So, excuse me. On to our issues. Right now, emergency funding is our first and foremost primary issue. Congress has already passed a couple bills that have dealt with a wide breadth of issues, such as sick leave, some relief for Small Business Administration loans, some unemployment funding. All of that, certainly masks and respirators and healthcare, and a lot of other federal actions that the administration is taking as well, all in an effort really to control the spread of COVID-19 and to make sure that that people aren't going to work, that they're not afraid of financial consequences and going to work as a result, and only making the situation worse. Right now, and you guys have probably been seeing a lot of this on the news, they are working on the largest stimulus bill that has ever existed. Latest reports is this stimulus bill was up to $2 trillion. And I know that is kind of hard to get into context, but $2 trillion, I believe the national federal budget for the entire United States government for the year is 1.5 trillion. So we're talking about spending more than the federal budget in order to solve this problem. So that's the scale of what we're talking about. The initial ask from the nonprofit sector as a whole was for $60 billion in federal aid to come through nonprofits. And so let's talk a little bit about what that looks like for the arts in terms of our ask. There's a link to the federal arts request right there at Americans for the Arts. We are asking for $4 billion in relief funding to go through the National Endowment for the Arts. NEA is going to distribute that to nonprofits, most likely through some mechanism at the North Carolina Arts Council, some of it directly. I don't have the answers to those questions. And I will say, just to underline the importance of filling out that financial impact survey, that data that we were able to have, and I will say that North Carolina had more responses by far than any other state to that survey, particularly in the early days, and I think we still lead. Keep that up, because that survey data that North Carolina put in and that we saw from across the country is actually what informed, through an algorithm spreading that out over the entire sector, that $4 billion ask. So that data is not only making the case, but it is making a difference right now. So make sure that you're filling that out. Also, I want to note there's a link there to Representative Adams out of the North Carolina 12th Congressional District. She represents Charlotte, North Carolina, and she sent a letter to the minority leader as well as Speaker Pelosi asking for $4 billion for the NEA as well as $4 billion for museums. So we really need to see more of that leadership, and we're so proud that we see that coming out of North Carolina's congressional delegation. Another part of this is expanding eligibility of all federal programs to artists and the creative economy at large. That's nonprofit and for-profit. We need to make sure that the federal government is working for our industry. The Americans for the Arts is asking that nonprofits get treated as small businesses with access to loans and assistance. And there's some good news on that I'll get to in a second. Also treating individual artists not just as individual taxpayers and getting that bonus check that we're talking about, if that ends up in the stimulus package, but also treating them as a small business, and so that they would have, that individual artists would have access to both of those forms of federal aid. So very important there. And also that there be additional funding available to help the for-profit arts sector. So that's part of the entire package. I can tell you that in North Carolina, nonprofits are eligible for Small Business Administration loans right now. That link will take you to the Small Business Administration loan site where you can start to look into that if that's something you need. They are capped at $2 million. The rate is 2.75%. That's for nonprofits. For-profits have to pay 3.75%. So we get a little cut there as a nonprofit. It's paid back over 30 years. Really thankful to the governor for making this request. I want to also thank Senator Tom Tillis that made the request to SBA to get this through, as well as Congressman Hudson and Congressman Price. You will notice that the 4 people that I just mentioned, 2 of them are Republicans, 2 of them are Democrats. We are working together on this, and we need to continue to have our attitude and make sure that we're messaging that together, that this is not a partisan issue. The arts are not partisan. This pandemic is certainly not partisan. With state arts funding here in North Carolina, I know many of you are aware that we don't have a budget. The General Assembly passed a budget for fiscal year 2020. It was vetoed by the governor. I'm not going to get into all the reasons why right now. The legislature was unable to override that veto, and as such, we are functioning on basically recurring items in the FY19 budget only. So this could actually be our saving grace. So anybody that was frustrated about that, I know that was a very frustrating time, but moving forward, there's $2.2 billion sitting in the state coffers that were unspent because we did not approve a budget. And now those dollars can be allocated to, as we start to have the conversation about how we're going to get back from this crisis. In addition to that, with $1.1 billion in reserves, so $3.3 billion that the state has available to start addressing this situation. That is not counting the unemployment trust fund. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The North Carolina House, the Speaker has assembled bipartisan crisis response groups, groups of legislators that are going to sort of break these issues down that we're going to be dealing with. Health issues, economic issues, trying to separate these out so that legislators can really dive in. Over half of the House of Representatives has already been assigned. They are actually bipartisan. Phil Berger has announced that the Senate is going to be dealing with this through the existing committee structures of the North Carolina Senate. I think that the Speaker has figured out that announcing bipartisan crisis response groups probably plays better in the media than saying we're existing committee structures, but know that they are both going to be taking this up and they're committed to working through this crisis. They are, however, if you're having a conversation with a legislator, they are waiting to see what's happening at the federal level. The relief packages are going to move down the ladder. So keep an eye on what's going on at the federal level. It's going to inform what goes on at the state level. In terms of Arts North Carolina, what we have done so far, we've sent out the calls to action. We hope that all of you are responding or encouraging your friends to respond. We have asked you to talk to Congress. Congress was, this is an active situation. If you haven't, please encourage all of your friends to respond to this call to action. It is crucially important. I can tell you that the initial conversations that were coming out of the negotiations this weekend were not promising. I heard out of the $4 billion that we requested, that the NEA was allocated $100 million. That is 1/40 of our request. So please push out that call to action. It is crucially important that Congress understand what we are about to face and how much we need that assistance, and that $100 million is not going to be enough. That $4 billion might not be enough, but we need to make sure that we're getting a decent piece of what is going on. So make your voice heard. The General Assembly, we sent that call to action out. As I said before, that was just sort of a touching base, letting them know what our priorities are. We're going to have these conversations. We're going to do more of a specific targeted push to the General Assembly once they start working in those crisis response groups and through the committee structure. We are also have had conversations with and have gotten some positive response from some key legislators that are responsible for the North Carolina Arts Council funding that we do a lot of work with, as well as some key leadership positions, particularly on the House side for the Appropriations Committee as a whole. So they are aware that we are hurting. They do recognize that this is a pretty big piece of North Carolina's economy, and that they are committed to addressing our concerns. Also, Arts North Carolina has started scheduled meetings with certain key people, meeting with both our U.S. senators and our representatives at the House of Representatives. We'll be meeting with staff for Senator Burr and Senator Tillis next Tuesday. I've got meetings that are getting arranged with some arts leaders to meet with Representative Price, working on Representative Adams and Representative Budd as well. So I'm going to be continuing to help facilitate those conversations at the federal level when I can get those conversations with staff. So, and I'll try and message that back out as to how those conversations are going. We are also talking to our Arts Caucus chairs, as the Joint Caucus on Arts and Arts Education. If you are not familiar with what that is and what they do, stick around for the second half of the webinar, because we will be talking about the Arts Caucus and the role that they have played traditionally, and the role that we hope they're going to be playing as we move through this crisis. Unemployment. Looks like I didn't get my slides quite fixed. Unemployment. Like I said, jobs are going to be lost. There's just no way around this. That link right there where it says unemployment insurance goes to an article that just came out this morning by David Heinen that covers a lot of the material. But if you do not have a working knowledge of how all unemployment for nonprofits is, it's 800 words, and it explains basically everything you need to know to get started. So I urge everybody to check out that article. I will say, look, I am not an unemployment insurance expert. If you do end up on unemployment and they're telling you something different than at the Department of Employment Securities than what I told you, they're the government agency. I am your advocate. I am trying to put information together as quickly as possible. So just a little disclaimer there. So the reality is that right now, many small profits do not pay unemployment insurance. They don't pay into the system. Primarily because a lot of nonprofits and small arts nonprofits have 4 employees or less. So they are not actually required to pay unemployment insurance at all. Some nonprofits that are bigger than 4 employees opt not to pay it on a regular basis, but then basically just to pay back the government for what they owe. With the massive amount of claims that they're going to be looking at, this could be devastating moving forward. So this is something to keep in mind. Another thing that we've really been focusing on over the last several days is that many self-employed contract, part-time, seasonal workers, and such as event performance personnel and independent artists are not eligible. A lot of independent artists are self-employed. Those event personnel, you know, your stagehands, they're the canaries in the coal mine. They already had all of their revenue, just like the contract musicians, etc., got shut off immediately because they get paid for services that they had already completed, or that they don't get paid for services until they've already completed them. So we're going to be seeing a major hit. Many of them are not eligible for unemployment. So we've got to figure out what to do about that. So just so that you're aware, back in 2013, there was legislation at the North Carolina General Assembly that pretty dramatically cut the size of the weekly benefits and the weeks. Benefits went from $525 maximum to $350 maximum. And you can now only collect 12 weeks. I believe it was 24 or 26 weeks was the maximum before 2013. So that is something to be addressed. However, and that this is really important, is that those actions that happened back in 2013 not only allowed the state of North Carolina to pay back the federal government what it owed for unemployment, but allowed us to amass a $3.9, almost $4 billion into the the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. So North Carolina is in a much better position than a lot of other states that might not have that much money per capita in their trust fund. So certainly you can look at this from either angle. I think that really the question right now is how do we find the solution, not what happened in 2013. So keep your eyes there. Also, many arts organizations that had a negative fund balance cannot file for employees. So if you were an employer that had that were using unemployment insurance quite a bit and a lot of claims filed against you after 2013 change, you were no longer able to file directly for that employee. They had to go and file on their own. So updates from more recent, back on March 12th, the U.S. Department of Labor allowed states to amend their rules specifically to address the COVID-19 crisis, specifically to address it so that all of a sudden the impact of this pandemic could be used as a reason to collect unemployment. The governor put out an executive order on March 17th that was because of that USDOL approval, and there was some money that came through one of those earlier bills that's going to help to pay for this executive order as well. So there's a federal state connection there. So what that order said is that employees of unemployment insurance paying employers, right, the ones who are eligible, if they are laid off due, they become eligible if they're laid off due to COVID-19, right? So if you're laid off as effective, you are automatically eligible. They have gotten rid of the waiting weeks. It used to be you had to wait a week to file and then wait a week for benefits. They have gotten away from that at all. You can file online. So they have streamlined the system. I actually just read an article that there is, I think, 113,000 new claims, new unemployment claims in North Carolina this week. So obviously the system is being utilized, but this is only being utilized for those people that are already eligible for unemployment. Also, employers, if you are worried about people filing against your company because of COVID-19, you do not have to worry about that. The executive order said that any unemployment claims filed against you will be, the companies are not penalized for the workers' filings. So what do we do about the situation, primarily those self-employed and contract artists that are not eligible for? You might start hearing something about this in the news recently. There hasn't been a whole lot about it out there. The Disaster Unemployment Assistance Program. It actually runs through the United States Department of Labor and FEMA. So it is a federal program that, when activated, runs through states and their unemployment agencies to cover those people that are not covered by unemployment insurance in a disaster, right? It is only able to be used in a federally proclaimed massive disaster area, and it lasts for 26 weeks. And the top benefit is whatever the top benefit is in the state where it's enacted. This is something that the governor has to request of the federal government, and the president of the United States has to declare. You may have seen that we have 3 states where this has already happened: New York, Washington State, and California now. So those states are now, the entire states are massive disaster areas, and DUA is something that those citizens of those states are eligible for. I do not know that that means that we are going to have to declare the entire country a disaster area before we have access to this funds, whether or not governors can request just for access to this funds. We're working through that situation now and trying to figure out how and what we're messaging specifically to the governor and his communications with the administration. And I'll update you as things change on that. Another option is that the state of North Carolina, when they come back into session, that they can extend temporary unemployment insurance benefits to those that are not currently eligible. That is an option that the state of North Carolina has. That is certainly something that we're going to be having a conversation about and trying to figure out the best way forward. I also know that there's some pretty, that Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer from New York was on CNN last night and was talking about part of that he wants to see part of that that multi-trillion-dollar package be a substantial unemployment package that would cover these workers that aren't covered and would actually pay a much higher percentage of their salaries. But we don't know what's going on with those negotiations, so I don't want people to get too excited about what's going on there.
Nate, we have a question. Nate, we have a question about unemployment insurance. Somebody's asking, is eligibility for unemployment insurance contingent upon having the illness or being a caretaker, or does a layoff due to business being shut count? It does count.
If you are laid off because your business is closed because of this pandemic, you are eligible for unemployment assistance in the state of North Carolina, as long as you were employed by a eligible employer. Okay. Any other questions before I go on? Okay. So we're very near the end anyway, actually. Arts North Carolina is our primary stance on this. This is number one that we're working on unemployment. We want to make sure that the self-employed, contract, part-time, seasonal, event and performance personnel, as well as those independent artists, are getting the unemployment help they need if they can't work because of this pandemic as soon as possible. So this is something that we're talking about with our partners nationally and really across the state, working with the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. Obviously, this is not just an arts issue. This is an everybody issue. So we're going to join our voice to others in order to make this. And if you saw the first call to action that we had with the General Assembly, that's why this was on there as well. We are also going to be having a conversation about increasing and extending the current state of benefits as they are. But right now, our primary concern is making sure that the entire arts field is getting the benefits that they need. And then we can have that conversation about looking at those benefits and seeing how they become more ample, more readily available, so that we can get folks through this very difficult time and to the other side of this as quickly as possible. So anyway, I'm more than happy to take any questions, Christine, if any come up. This is kind of the end of the first part. This is just the COVID-19 portion, but I am going to continue to talk for another 20 minutes or so as I move through a relatively condensed webinar about Arts North Carolina and who we are, as well as what we do and how to talk to legislators and how that plays into the larger advocacy structure. So.
Somebody asked, is a furlough the same as a layoff in regards to unemployment insurance?
So a furlough is a temporary layoff, right? So a furlough is basically means that you're attached, right? And you might hear that attached or unattached claims. So as long as your employer has somebody there to file it and has furloughed you, they may be able to file that claim for you. You can ask that question if that's what they intend to do, or you can do it. But yes, that is completely eligible because it is temporary layoff.
Another question is, are there examples that they can see of the stories that we should be collecting to bolster our case?
Two types of stories, I think. I don't have a specific example because I've been really working on the data and the policy. I'd love to see us in the coming weeks when we get a second, put together a data collection space for stories. We had a membership spotlight that is still live, I believe, on the About section of our website, or members or something like that. Please feel free to share those stories on that membership spotlight. It has an intake mechanism so that we can use it. Like I said, two types of stories. There's going to be the stories about why this is bad, right? The stories about the impact, the stories about the kids and the audiences that aren't receiving programming. Maybe that's personal. Maybe that's one person's story. Maybe it's a story about several hundred people or several thousand people. The other story, my lobbyist actually brought this up, the silver linings, the little silver lining playbook, right? Like we need that hope, and the arts are going to be a really fantastic place to hear it. I took 2 minutes to listen to a little bit of a jazz concert by Shauna Tucker over on Saturday. You know, there's all sorts of stories about inspiring concerts, free opera, free music concerts, free theater, free art classes. My 13-year-old was standing in the foyer taking her dance class on Friday, and that's how she's keeping this going. So stories like that about the resiliency of the art and the hope that it brings us, that's going to be really important too. So we need both, right? We need to paint a picture of how hard it is, and we need to also paint a picture of how the arts are going to bring us together. I don't know, there's been an internet meme going around about how everybody seems to be really excited about accessing the arts for free on the internet now that we're in the middle of this crisis. And we all really hope that they remember that the next time they talk about cutting funding for the arts. So that's really the story that we're going to need to start telling.
We've got another question here. Where can an arts organization get legal assistance about financial problems due to COVID-19, even assistance to determine if the organization will need to file bankruptcy?
Sure. I would say best resource for that off the top of my head would probably be the North Carolina Center for Nonprofit. And if you are not a member of the North Carolina Center for Nonprofit, I strongly encourage you, I know this is a difficult economic time, but to go ahead and pay your membership because they're going to need that support, as are many organizations that are doing this crisis management work, such as Arts NC. They've got some legal help, and they can probably point you in the right direction. There might also be some local help as well for nonprofits. I'm not sure. It would depend on finding that help. Also, huge resource is going to be your local arts councils. I have no doubt. I've met with so many of the arts council leaders across the state. I think we have 85 of them over 100 counties. These are the people that are going to be leading the charge. These are going to be the people that are organizing your specific communities and kind of finding a way forward and helping everybody to work together. We're going to be working with them. We're going to be working with all of you to work together, but it really is about collaboration. But those arts councils should probably, if they don't have legal aid, hopefully would be able to point you in the right direction as well.
Somebody wrote in that Triangle Artworks has lawyers for the arts group, but it
Absolutely.
may just be for individuals, but they might be somebody that can give you a reference.
Right, and I know Triangle Artworks, Beth Yerxa does an amazing job providing those services. So please utilize that if you're in the Triangle. Might not be a bad idea to check out what resources she has, even if you're not in the Triangle. It's a fantastic organization that deals very much on professional development as well as legal and financial services for artists.
There's another question. Is the federal arts funding request currently in the giant stimulus bill, or are we asking for it to be included?
So yes, in the stimulus bill that they are kicking around, that's the $100 million I was talking about. I mean, that's just a report. I don't know where it stands because that is moving so quickly. But the information I have is that there's $100 million. We had asked for $4 billion. So we need 40 times more. Though I think that in terms of messaging to Congress right now, we don't need to talk about the $100 million. We need to talk about the $4 billion, right? Like you can say, you know, we're really worried. We're hearing rumors that the NEA funding isn't where it needs to be. The $4 billion is a necessity for the good of our industry. So in your messaging to congressmen and congresswomen, just stress that $4 billion. I think that needs to be the focus.
I don't see any more questions. If you have a question, go ahead and type it. Maybe you could go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it quickly before we move on to the next section. Okay.
All right. Well, look, guys, for those of you that are going to be hopping off the webinar, I want to thank you very much. for taking the time. And for those of you staying on, I do have a lot of interesting stuff. So if you're even a little bit curious, please stay on the line for the next 20, 30 minutes or so as I go through the next part of the slide. For those of you leaving, I'll leave you with this because I think we need a little inspiration. This is my favorite Margaret Mead quote that comes to me at times like this. And it is never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So find your inspiration and get to work and keep checking our website for details. So thank you for those that are leaving us.